When arrogant Judge Harriet Stone publicly ridicules a shabby teenage defendant, she has no idea she's about to be schooled by a legal prodigy who's secretly documenting judicial bias, and her courtroom is his final exam. Judge Harriet Stone strode purposefully through the crowded courthouse hallway, her black robes billowing behind her like storm clouds. At 67, she had presided over more juvenile cases than she cared to remember, and the jadedness had settled into the lines of her face. Two courthouse clerks hurried alongside her, clutching folders and trying to keep pace. "Judge Stone, the Henderson case is first on your docket today," said the first clerk, a nervous young man who had only been working at the courthouse for 3 months. He pushed his glasses up his nose as he spoke, a habit that Judge Stone found increasingly irritating. Judge Stone sighed heavily, not breaking her stride. "Another juvenile delinquent? What is it this time?" Her voice carried the weariness of someone who had heard every excuse in the book, who had watched generations of young troublemakers come through her courtroom with the same stories, the same attitudes. The second clerk, a more seasoned woman who knew the judge's moods, replied carefully, "Yes, Your Honor. 17-year-old caught trespassing at the old Westlake property, the abandoned industrial site." "Let me guess," Judge Stone said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Another teenager who thinks laws don't apply to him. I've seen it 1,000 times. They come in with their hoodies and their attitudes, thinking they're above the system." She shook her head as they approached the courtroom doors. "Well, not in my courtroom." The clerks exchanged knowing glances as they followed the judge into the courtroom. Today would be like any other day in Judge Stone's court. Swift, severe, and by the book. Or so they thought. The courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity. District attorneys reviewed their notes, public defenders conferred with their clients, and court officers maintained a watchful eye over the proceedings. Judge Stone settled into her high-backed chair, adjusting her glasses and surveying the room with the practiced gaze of someone who considered this space her domain. "First case," announced the bailiff, a burly man whose voice carried to the back of the room. "The State versus Elijah Henderson, juvenile, case number J2025-1047. All eyes turned to the defendant's table, where a lanky teenager slouched in his chair. Elijah Henderson wore ill-fitting jeans, a wrinkled button-up shirt that might have been borrowed, and sneakers that had seen better days. His hair was uncombed, and he kept his eyes down, seemingly intimidated by the formality of the proceedings. Beside him sat a harried public defender who was clearly juggling too many cases that morning. Judge Stone looked down at the teenager over the rims of her glasses, her expression a mixture of disappointment and irritation. These cases were always the same. Kids who thought they were invincible until they found themselves in her courtroom. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "you're charged with criminal trespassing on private property, a Class B misdemeanor. How do you plead?" Elijah Henderson raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting the judge's. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Not fear or uncertainty, but something else that Judge Stone couldn't quite place. "Your Honor," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "before I enter a plea, I'd like to request permission to represent myself in these proceedings." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The public defender beside Elijah looked startled, then leaned over to whisper urgently in the boy's ear. Judge Stone's eyebrows shot up in surprise, then quickly furrowed in annoyance. "Mr. Henderson," Judge Stone said with a condescending chuckle that silenced the courtroom, "legal representation is not a game. This isn't a television drama where someone with no legal training can walk in and win their case with dramatic speeches." She leaned forward slightly. "You're 17 years old. What could you possibly know about courtroom procedure or criminal statutes?" Elijah remained calm, his posture straightening slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe I'm within my constitutional rights to represent myself if I so choose, provided I'm deemed competent to do so. The Sixth Amendment, coupled with Ferretta v. California, establishes this right quite clearly." The judge's expression froze. The courtroom fell completely silent. District Attorney Maria Rodriguez looked up from her paperwork, suddenly interested in what had seemed like a routine case moments before. "Young man," Judge Stone said slowly, her voice carrying a hint of warning, Quoting case law doesn't qualify you to practice it, and frankly, your current situation doesn't speak highly of your decision-making abilities. Elijah nodded respectfully. I understand your concern, Your Honor. Perhaps I could demonstrate my competence by explaining why the charges against me are fundamentally flawed from both a statutory and evidentiary perspective. Judge Stone leaned back in her chair, curiosity getting the better of her irritation. Very well, Mr. Henderson. You have 2 minutes to convince me you shouldn't be represented by actual counsel. The clock starts now. The public defender slumped back in resignation as Elijah stood, transforming before everyone's eyes. His shoulders squared, his voice grew more confident, and his eyes sharpened with intelligence. Thank you, Your Honor. First, the charging document alleges I trespassed on private property, specifically the Westlake Industrial Site. However, as established in County Records Document DOILA 7851, filed 3 months ago, the property reverted to county ownership due to tax delinquency. As such, it is currently public property, not private. The district attorney hastily flipped through her files, looking alarmed. Second, Elijah continued, growing more confident with each word. The arresting officer, Officer Jenkins, stated in his report that he observed me entering through a broken fence at 5:17 p.m. However, Officer Jenkins was simultaneously filing an incident report across town at 5:22 p.m., as documented in the police database. The physical impossibility of being in 2 places at once suggests either a clerical error or a case of mistaken identity. Judge Stone's expression had transformed from dismissive to stunned. The bailiff's mouth hung slightly open. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, momentarily mesmerized by the teenager's presentation. Finally, Elijah said, consulting no notes, speaking as if he had prepared for this moment his entire life. I would direct the court's attention to Municipal Code Section 12.457, which explicitly exempts persons engaged in historical documentation, environmental assessment, or educational research from trespassing statutes on county-owned abandoned properties. My presence at the site was to document the historical architecture for my senior thesis on post-industrial urban spaces. Judge Stone stared at Elijah for a long moment after he finished speaking. She removed her glasses slowly, placing them on the bench before her. Mr. Henderson, she said carefully, that was unexpectedly thorough. Where exactly did you learn about these legal matters? Elijah hesitated, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a leather credential holder. Your Honor, my name is Elijah Henderson. I am a licensed attorney in this state, and I also serve as a legal consultant for juvenile justice partners. I passed a bar exam last year through an exceptional circumstances provision. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Judge Stone banged her gavel for silence, her face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. Explain yourself immediately, she demanded. Why the charade? Elijah nodded respectfully. No charade, Your Honor. I am 17, and I was at the Westlake property, though legally as I've explained. I've spent the past year working undercover, documenting systemic biases in how juvenile defendants are treated in courtrooms across the state, with particular focus on how appearances, socioeconomic indicators, and first impressions influence judicial treatment before any evidence is even presented. The district attorney had gone pale. The public defender was staring at Elijah with newfound respect. Court spectators were frantically texting, surely spreading the news of what was unfolding. Your Honor, Elijah continued, his voice now taking on the measured tone of a seasoned attorney. I'm not here to embarrass the court or create a spectacle. I'm here because the data we've collected shows alarming disparities in how young defendants are addressed, how their statements are weighted, and ultimately, how their cases are decided. Judge Stone sat behind her desk, looking considerably more subdued than she had earlier. Across from her sat Elijah, now wearing a crisp blazer over his previously rumpled shirt. Also present was the district attorney and the chief judge of the county. So the entire study has been authorized by the State Bar Association's Special Committee on Juvenile Justice. Judge Stone asked, reviewing the documents before her. The chief judge nodded. Yes, Harriet. Mr. Henderson here is something of a prodigy. Completed his law degree by 16. passed the bar with special permission at 17. The committee approached him specifically because he could authentically present as a juvenile defendant. Elijah spoke softly but with conviction. Judge Stone, I want to be clear that our study isn't about individual judges, but about patterns in the system. We've documented over 300 cases where juveniles were subjected to prejudicial treatment based on appearance, manner of speech, or perceived attitude, before any evidence was heard. Judge Stone was quiet for a long moment. Including my courtroom today. Including your courtroom today, Elijah confirmed. The recording devices in my backpack captured your comments in the hallway about another teenager who thinks laws don't apply to him, and your assumptions about hoodies and attitudes, all before you'd even seen me. Setting the stage. This pivotal scene takes place in the same courtroom where Judge Stone previously mocked Elijah Henderson, but the atmosphere has undergone a profound shift. 1 week has passed since the revelation that the seemingly ordinary teenage defendant was actually a legal prodigy conducting research on bias in the juvenile justice system. During this intervening week, significant behind-the-scenes developments have occurred. Judge Stone has been forced to confront her own prejudices, meet with superior court officials, and reckon with the implications of Elijah's study. The courtroom is now packed to capacity. A visual representation of how what began as a routine case has transformed into something much more significant. The presence of reporters lining the back wall indicates that word has spread about what transpired the previous week, elevating this from a local courtroom matter to a newsworthy event that could potentially spark broader systemic change. The judge's transformation. When Judge Stone enters the courtroom in this scene, she embodies the thematic heart of the entire script: transformation. Her physical entrance mirrors her internal journey. She carries herself differently, with a demeanor described as solemn but somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. This subtle but important detail suggests that confronting her biases, while initially painful and embarrassing, has ultimately been liberating. The judge who once moved through the courthouse halls with stern authority now enters with a humility that actually enhances rather than diminishes her judicial presence. This represents the paradoxical truth that acknowledging one's flaws requires greater strength than maintaining a facade of perfection. Breaking protocol. Judge Stone's announcement that she has something to say before the day's proceedings begins is significant because it breaks from standard courtroom procedure. This deliberate departure from protocol symbolizes her willingness to step outside the rigid patterns that have defined her judicial career. By interrupting the normal flow of the court's business, she signals that something extraordinary has occurred and must be addressed. The curious glances exchanged by courthouse regulars emphasize that this is not standard procedure. Judge Stone is venturing into uncharted territory, modeling the very flexibility and openness to change that her revelation will demand from the entire court system. Public accountability. Perhaps the most powerful element of this scene is Judge Stone's public admission of her own biases. Rather than handling the matter privately, or through administrative channels, she chooses to make her statement in open court, with journalists present. This represents true accountability, not just acknowledging wrongdoing in private, but taking responsibility before the same public that witnessed, or would have witnessed, the effects of her biased approach. The phrase "biases that I myself demonstrated" is particularly powerful because she doesn't hide behind institutional language or passive voice. She explicitly owns her behavior and places herself at the center of both the problem and the solution. The symbolic partnership. When Judge Stone gestures to Elijah Henderson, now properly dressed in a suit and standing at the side of the courtroom, she creates a powerful visual tableau. The teenager, who was previously the object of her derision, is now her partner in reform. By physically directing the court's attention to him and verbally ceding her platform to him, she demonstrates a genuine transfer of power and recognition of his expertise despite his youth. This moment challenges multiple biases simultaneously, not just those against defendants based on appearance, but also prejudices about age, credentials, and who deserves to speak with authority in a courtroom setting. Institutional endorsement. Judge Stone's mention that the new guidelines have been approved by the Chief Judge and the State Bar Association is critical to the scene's effectiveness. It shows that what began as a confrontation between two individuals has already catalyzed broader institutional change. This detail prevents the scene from feeling like merely a personal redemption story and elevates it to a narrative about systems change. It also lends credibility to the reforms, suggesting they are substantive rather than symbolic gestures designed to save face. Elijah's evolution. When Elijah approaches the podium, he is described as carrying himself with the confidence of someone twice his age. This marks his own transformation from someone who needed to disguise his abilities to someone who can openly claim his expertise and authority. The contrast between his previous slouched, intimidated demeanor and his current confident bearing illustrates how people often perform the roles society expects of them. As a juvenile delinquent, he adopted that posture, but now acknowledged as a legal expert, he embodies that role instead. This subtle detail comments on how justice system expectations and prejudgments can become self-fulfilling prophecies for young defendants. The reforms themselves. The specific reforms Elijah outlines. Mandatory bias training for all court personnel. A structured interview protocol to ensure all juvenile defendants have equal opportunity to present their circumstances, and an independent review board to monitor sentencing patterns are noteworthy for their systemic approach. Rather than focusing solely on individual behavior change, these measures create structural accountability and standardized processes that can survive beyond any individual judge or court officer's tenure. The reforms address prevention, training, process, interview protocols, and oversight, review board, creating a comprehensive approach to addressing bias in the juvenile justice system. Dramatic resolution. This scene serves as the dramatic resolution to the central conflict established in the opening scenes. The judge who once dismissed a teenager based on appearance and assumptions now publicly acknowledges her error and implements concrete changes. The power dynamic has been completely reversed, but not in a manner that humiliates Judge Stone. Instead, the resolution honors her capacity for growth while still holding her accountable. This balance, celebrating transformation without excusing past harm, is what makes the scene emotionally satisfying while still maintaining its moral integrity. Broader implications. Beyond the specifics of these two characters, this scene speaks to broader themes about institutional justice and reform. It suggests that meaningful change often comes from unexpected challenges to the system rather than from within established power structures. Elijah's undercover approach may have been unorthodox, but it produced results where conventional advocacy had failed. The scene also suggests that true justice requires ongoing vigilance and structural safeguards rather than simply relying on the good intentions of those in power. Judge Stone may have renewed her commitment to fairness, but the implementation of formal review processes acknowledges that systemic issues require systemic solutions. The audience's role. The presence of reporters and a packed courtroom creates an important role for witnesses in this scene. Justice is not only done but seen to be done. The public nature of both the original bias and the subsequent reforms underscores the importance of transparency in judicial proceedings. The courtroom audience serves as a proxy for the script's actual audience, modeling how we should respond to acknowledgments of error and commitments to change, not with continued condemnation, but with attentive observation and cautious optimism. Symbolic renewal. Judge Stone's announcement represents not just policy changes, but personal renewal. When she references new procedural guidelines, she is also implicitly referencing her own new approach to her judicial responsibilities. The formality of her language contrasts with the deeply personal nature of the transformation she has undergone, creating a poignant tension between professional duty and personal growth. This scene ultimately suggests that true justice requires both rigorous protocols and genuine human empathy. Neither is sufficient without the other. As the moral center of the entire script, it transforms what could have been merely a clever gotcha narrative into a meaningful exploration of accountability, growth, and systemic change. By having Judge Stone publicly acknowledge her biases and partner with Elijah to implement reforms, the scene fulfills the promise of the script's premise, while avoiding both cynical resignation and unrealistic idealism. It suggests that while prejudice runs deep in our justice system, so too does the potential for meaningful reform when those with power are willing to acknowledge their fallibility, and those who have been marginalized are empowered to share their expertise. The courthouse steps carries profound symbolic weight within the narrative structure. Positioned as the follow-up to the formal courtroom announcement of reforms, this scene deliberately takes place in a transitional space that sits between the institutional world of law and the public realm of everyday citizens. The courthouse steps have historically served as the site where justice meets the public square, where verdicts are announced, where attorneys make statements to the press, and where the abstract principles of law interface with community impact. By placing Judge Stone and Elijah in this liminal space, the script emphasizes that true reform must bridge the gap between institutional procedures and public accountability. The timing of later that day is equally significant. The immediate succession to the courtroom scene demonstrates continuity of purpose rather than a temporary performance of contrition. Had the scene jumped forward weeks or months, it might have suggested that the courtroom announcement was merely performative. Instead, Judge Stone and Elijah move directly from institutional reform inside the courtroom to public engagement outside, showing their commitment to transparency and immediate action. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps creates visual symbolism suggesting both illumination, the truth coming to light, and the lingering influence of past practices, shadows of the old system still present. The physical positioning of Judge Stone and Elijah side by side creates a powerful visual tableau that would be immediately striking to both the in-story reporters and the audience. This horizontal arrangement stands in stark contrast to the vertical power dynamic established in the early courtroom scenes, where Judge Stone looked down from her bench at the supposedly delinquent teenager. Now they stand as equals before the public, a physical manifestation of the transformation in their relationship and in Judge Stone's understanding of justice. Their unity in physical space represents their newly aligned purpose despite their different backgrounds, ages, and initial positions in the judicial hierarchy. The presence of reporters and microphones transforms what could have been a private redemption into a public commitment. By speaking their truths, not just to each other, but to the wider world, Judge Stone and Elijah elevate their personal reconciliation to a platform for systemic change. The media presence serves multiple narrative functions. It amplifies the impact of their partnership beyond the individual case, it creates accountability through public documentation of their commitments, and it suggests that transparency itself is part of the reform they seek to implement. This public declaration makes it much harder for either of them, or the system they represent, to retreat from the promises being made. Judge Stone's admission: "It's not easy to admit when you've been wrong, especially after 30 years on the bench," reveals vulnerability rarely associated with judicial authority. This statement accomplishes several things simultaneously. It humanizes a character initially presented as rigidly authoritarian. It acknowledges the particular difficulty of admitting error when one's professional identity is built around making correct judgments, and it implicitly recognizes how institutional longevity can calcify biases rather than dissolve them. The specific mention of 30 years on the bench reminds us that what's being challenged here is not just an individual judge's prejudice, but decades of accumulated institutional practice. The judge's articulation that our justice system can only function properly when we acknowledge its flaws and work to correct them elevates her personal growth into a broader philosophical position about justice itself. This statement represents a profound shift from her initial defensive posture, protecting the system's status quo. She now recognizes that true fidelity to justice requires constant critical examination, rather than blind loyalty to existing procedures. This evolving understanding of her role situates her personal transformation within a larger argument about institutional integrity, that systems maintain legitimacy not by claiming perfection, but by demonstrating capacity for self-correction. The reporter's question about whether Judge Stone will continue presiding over juvenile cases creates dramatic tension by suggesting potential consequences for her career. This moment acknowledges the real-world reality that admitting bias can sometimes lead to professional repercussions. Judge Stone's firm "absolutely" in response demonstrates moral courage. She's not seeking to escape accountability or difficult work, but rather embracing the opportunity to apply her new insights. Her commitment to true justice, not just efficient processing of cases, directly addresses her earlier character flaw of prioritizing procedural efficiency over individualized consideration. When Judge Stone describes Elijah's study as a wake-up call, not just for me, but for our entire judicial district, she appropriately contextualizes her individual failings within systemic shortcomings. This prevents the narrative from suggesting that bias is merely a problem of bad apples rather than institutional culture. By acknowledging the wider implications, she demonstrates awareness that meaningful reform must extend beyond her own courtroom. The phrase wake-up call is particularly apt, suggesting both the jarring nature of confronting one's biases and the state of unconsciousness that allowed those biases to operate unexamined for so long. The shift in focus to Elijah through the second reporter's question creates balance in the scene and prevents Judge Stone's redemption from overshadowing Elijah's accomplishment. The reporter's acknowledgement of Elijah as possibly the youngest practicing attorney in the country validates his exceptional abilities, while the question about what's next shifts the narrative from past confrontation to future collaboration. This movement from conflict to cooperation is central to the scene's thematic purpose. Elijah's response about continuing the work emphasizes that reform is an ongoing process rather than a single event. His clarification, not through deception, but through education and reform, acknowledges that while his undercover approach was necessary to expose entrenched biases, sustainable change requires transparent methods and institutional buy-in. This statement serves as both a moral reconciliation with his deceptive tactics and a practical recognition of effective reform strategies. It shows character growth paralleling Judge Stone's. Both have learned something about effective advocacy, and both have modified their approaches as a result. The announcement of Judge Stone's agreement to co-chair a statewide commission on juvenile justice reform with Elijah transforms their relationship from adversarial to collaborative and expands their impact from a single courtroom to statewide policy. This development cleverly resolves several narrative tensions. It provides appropriate status to Elijah's expertise despite his youth. It creates a meaningful role for Judge Stone that leverages her experience while incorporating new perspectives, and it institutionalizes their partnership in a way that can create lasting change beyond individual cases. The statewide commission serves as a tangible manifestation of how personal transformation can catalyze systemic reform when properly channeled. Judge Stone's reflection that sometimes the best lessons come from the most unexpected teachers articulates the thematic heart of the entire script. This statement explicitly acknowledges the reversal of the traditional power dynamic between judge and defendant, between experienced professional and teenager. By recognizing Elijah as her teacher despite his youth and initial appearance, Judge Stone demonstrates the very openness to unexpected wisdom that was previously lacking in her approach to juvenile defendants. The phrase, even for a judge with decades on the bench, acknowledges that expertise and experience, while valuable, can sometimes entrench biases rather than eliminate them. The handshake between Judge Stone and Elijah represents formal reconciliation and partnership, transforming their relationship from hierarchical to collaborative. This simple physical gesture carries significant symbolic weight. Hands that once held a gavel in judgment now extend in cooperation. The physical distance that separated bench from defendant table is closed. The description of Elijah shaking her hand firmly suggests confidence and equal standing rather than deference, while maintaining respect for her position and experience. The cameras flashing around them serve multiple narrative purposes. They document this unlikely partnership for public record. They suggest media interest that will help spread these reforms beyond this courthouse, and they literally illuminate this moment of transformation. The script's description of them, as symbols of a system that for all its flaws, still contained the possibility of growth and change, elevates their specific story to a broader comment on institutional reform. This final image suggests cautious optimism rather than naive idealism, acknowledging the system's flaws while affirming its possibility of growth. The public manifestation of the private transformation that occurred in previous scenes. While Judge Stone's internal recognition of bias and the formal courtroom announcement of procedural changes were crucial developments, this public declaration on the courthouse steps represents the integration of personal, institutional, and community dimensions of justice reform. By literally stepping outside the courthouse to address the public, Judge Stone and Elijah demonstrate that true reform cannot remain confined within institutional walls but must engage with and be accountable to the communities served by the justice system. The scene deliberately avoids portraying this partnership as a complete solution or finished achievement. Instead, it positions their collaboration as the beginning of a longer process, with the commission they will co-chair providing structure for ongoing work. This framing acknowledges the reality that bias and systemic inequities cannot be eliminated through a single confrontation or policy change, but require sustained effort and institutional commitment. By focusing on future work rather than past accomplishment, the scene invites both characters and audience to understand reform as a journey rather than a destination. Judge Stone and Elijah's alliance as unlikely partners underscores the script's argument that meaningful change often comes from unexpected connections across traditional divides of age, status, and perspective. Their partnership models the very integration of diverse viewpoints that their reforms seek to institutionalize in the juvenile justice system. The imagery of the old judge and the teenage attorney, standing together, creates a visually compelling representation of bridging generational and hierarchical gaps in service of a shared commitment to justice. By concluding with this public proclamation, before moving to the montage of actual reforms in the next scene, the script creates both accountability and anticipation. The public nature of their commitments establishes stakes for their future actions. They must now deliver on promises made before witnesses and cameras. This scene thus serves as both resolution of the initial conflict and exposition for the reform efforts that will follow, bridging the script's central confrontation with its vision of systemic change. Montage. Various locations. Over the next year. A series of quick scenes show the ripple effects of the Henderson case. Judge Stone presides over a juvenile hearing, taking time to speak directly and respectfully to a young defendant, listening intently to their explanation. Elijah addresses a lecture hall full of law students, his presentation slide reading, Bias in the Juvenile Justice System, Identification and Intervention. A group of judges attend a training session, watching video examples of problematic courtroom interactions, taking notes, and engaging in thoughtful discussion. Judge Stone and Elijah appearing on a national news program, discussing their unlikely partnership and the reforms they've implemented. A courthouse break room where court officers and clerks are reading a new procedural manual titled Equitable Treatment Protocols for Juvenile Defendants. A new 17-year-old defendant stands before Judge Stone, nervous but treated with dignity. The judge's manner is firm but fair, her questions aimed at understanding rather than judging. At the back of the courtroom, Elijah observes, now 18 and looking more mature. Beside him sits a colleague from the Juvenile Justice Partners. The Henderson Protocol is working, the colleague whispers, showing Elijah statistics on a tablet. Recidivism down 23% in cases where it's been implemented. Elijah nods, watching Judge Stone, once his adversary, now his ally, as she carefully explains the legal options to the young defendant. It was never about embarrassing her, Elijah whispers back. It was about changing the system. Judge Stone and Elijah share a cup of coffee, reviewing case files together. You know, Judge Stone says with a wry smile, not a day goes by that I don't think about that morning. How quickly I judged you, how certain I was. Elijah shrugs. That was the point of the study. We all carry biases. The difference is whether we're willing to recognize and address them. Judge Stone nods thoughtfully. When I took the bench 30 years ago, I promised myself I'd never become one of those cynical judges who sees defendants as case numbers instead of people. She sighs. Somewhere along the way, I broke that promise to myself. But you've renewed it, Elijah points out. That's what matters now. They clink their coffee mugs together in a toast to progress. Slow and imperfect, but progress nonetheless. Courthouse SDPS, sunset. As the day ends, Judge Stone descends the courthouse steps, passing two teenagers sitting there. One is explaining to the other how the court system works, what their rights are. The judge pauses, listening. Remember, the teen is saying, Judge Stone's courtroom is fair. Stand up straight, explain your situation clearly, and she'll listen. She's tough, but she's fair. Judge Stone smiles to herself and continues down the steps, her silhouette backlit by the setting sun, a different judge than she was a year ago. Changed by an encounter with an extraordinary young man who dared to hold a mirror up to justice itself.